We begin with that breaking news from Ukraine. President Zelensky says his country will host a meeting of the leaders of what's known as the Coalition of the Willing tomorrow, nations which support Ukraine in its war against the Russian invasion. He's made the announcement after attending remotely a meeting of the European countries participating in what's known as the Joint Expeditionary Force. Well, he said on the social media site X that the countries were working together to try to achieve what he described as a solid ceasefire, which would last for at least 30 days. Our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, has the latest from Kyiv.
Well, this is a group of nations, up to 31 nations, headed by the UK and France, or spearheaded by them, I should say, to try and put together some kind of a reassurance force for the day when there is finally a lasting peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Problem is, that day could be still a very long way off, despite the expectations and earlier optimism of the White House. It's officially been called the Multinational Force for Ukraine. It's not a peacekeeping force. I think that's an important point to make. They're not going to be there trying to separate the two sides like that. It's meant to be a reassurance force to bolster Ukraine's security for the years to come after there is a peace deal. Now, I have to say, I think it is absolutely fraught with obstacles, one of the most obvious which, is that Russia has always said they will not tolerate the presence of NATO countries, NATO troops in Ukraine under whatever badge, beret or helmet they're under. So that has got to be got over. This force will have to have some kind of deterrence to it for it to be effective. But that's yet to be thrashed out. So I think we'll know a lot more once it's actually happened. We haven't yet got details of who's attending, where it'll be, or at what time.
Well, as Frank says, lots to be thrashed out. As we go through our 3-hour programme today, we will learn, I'm sure, more of the details. As we were saying there, North European leaders meeting to discuss Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky addressed that meeting in Oslo by video link. Here's a little of what he's been saying.
There has to be a full ceasefire, and if Russia keeps dragging out the war, we'll need stronger sanctions, especially if they break the ceasefire when it finally happens. The US and all of you in Europe know what hurts Russia the most and what really puts pressure on Moscow to think about peace and stopping this war.
Well, that was President Zelensky attending that meeting in Oslo. Is the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. He's been speaking also in the last hour or so.
The message of leaders here is very, very clear, and that is that we're focused on Ukraine, and we've been with NATO allies here in Norway. President Zelensky came in virtually to part of that meeting. So our focus is on Ukraine with our European allies. Of course, today we also announced our biggest ever sanctions package against the Russian shadow fleet. Really important work, again, discussed with our allies this afternoon. And so that's where our absolute focus is with Ukraine, defending the values that yesterday at VE Day we were remembering and commemorating that were hard won in the Second World War.
Well, lots of focus on this story. Donald Trump has repeated his call for a 30-day ceasefire on the Truth social media platform. Now, Finland's President Alexander Stubb was at that meeting there in Oslo. Now, he summarised the developments following today's summit.
I think there were 3 key elements that we should look at in President Trump's Truth Social post. Number 1 was American engagement in the peace process. Number 2 was a 30-day ceasefire. And number 3 was outlining a sanctions package if Putin does not accept the ceasefire peace. So all in all, I think we took big steps forward.
Well, that was Finland's president. Let's pull all of these strands together. Let's speak to John Lough, who's head of policy at the new Eurasia Strategy Centre. He was previously managed NATO's information office in Russia. Thank you so much for being with us. So we have this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in Kyiv tomorrow. You just heard Finland's president at one stage. He said, I can't give an exact timetable, but an ideal world. Are a Ukraine ceasefire would be declared over the weekend. So where do you think we are with all of this?
I don't think we're close to the sort of ceasefire that Ukraine and its international partners are seeking. The Russians want to set conditions for a ceasefire, and those are not acceptable to Ukraine. And so I think we are going to be in a situation for probably the coming days and possibly weeks where the game continues. The US starts to hint at the possibility of harsher sanctions. There's more talk about how to arm Ukraine if the war continues, because I think this is Putin's vulnerability at the end of the day, that he can certainly find manpower. The indications the Russians are losing about 1,000 men a day, dead and injured, but they can replace roughly that number, 30,000 a month. But the real bottleneck is probably equipment, because they're burning through huge stocks of old Soviet equipment. So the real question is how the United States and its allies can put pressure on Moscow now to reconsider its position. But for now, it looks as though Putin's digging his heels in and hoping that probably that President Trump will simply give up and move on to something else, and that Putin just carry on in this groove, or indeed that Trump might in fact put greater pressure again on President Zelensky and force him to make compromises.
You make a number of really important points in that answer. Let me go through it stage by stage. You mentioned Vladimir Putin. He was sitting alongside President Xi in Moscow and other world leaders for Victory Day, marking the 80th anniversary of the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany, with that parade and all of that. But Finland's president also saying Russia is in a worse position than perceived. Now is the time to put pressure. When people talk of pressure, what do you think is the real pressure point that could be applied on Moscow if they don't play ball here?
Well, there is a misguided belief in a number of Western capitals that with a little bit of more economic pressure, the Russians will collapse. The Russian economy is not what it was 30 years ago at the end of the Soviet Union. And we have to face the fact that it has a lot of resilience. As long as the Russians can carry on selling oil to India, China, and others, the economy will stay afloat. They have some quite substantial reserves still. That doesn't mean to say that things won't get more difficult. Of course they will. The pressure of other sanctions, certainly technology sanctions, are certainly having an effect on Russian industry, including the defense industry. And this is probably where the greatest effect can be achieved. It's a combination of tightening those technological sanctions, ensuring that Russia can't receive the latest machine building equipment, the sort of things that are required to produce armaments at scale, and at the same time arming Ukraine for the next stage of the war. And I think there's a belief in Moscow that because the United States doesn't want to foot the bill any longer, President Trump really wants to get the United States out of this war, that the Europeans themselves are not yet in a position to arm Ukraine sufficiently. And therefore Russia can make use of this superiority on the battlefield in both in terms of equipment at the moment and of course men.